Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice, and I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. Tanis McDonald. Tanis is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has her PhD in English with a specialization in Canadian literature. Her current research focuses on modernist and contemporary poetry. She's also the editor of the Laurier Poetry Series, part of Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and the author of several books, including her most recent, Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female, a collection of essays about the importance of walking, being female while doing it, and the social commentary that emerges from it. Tanis is also a very active and vocal advocate for the study and support of contemporary Canadian poets. This four-part series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this third episode, we examine the appeal of poetry to younger students, Tanis's advocacy of Canadian poets, and what it means to practice your art no matter where you live. Poetry, we were just talking about the younger generation, and poetry certainly appeals to the younger generation. But I'm wondering if you can contextualize that a little bit more, and with today's students in Canada, and I guess anywhere really. But what is it about contemporary Canadian poetry that's resonating with students today?
I think it's interesting that experimental poetry is taught so little in this country, because whenever I teach it, students are there's always not every single student is glad to read it, but there's always a certain segment of students that say, I didn't know you could do this, look at this language play, look at what they're doing. I just taught a book of erasure poems.
What are erasure poems?
An erasure poem is when you take an existing text, usually a non-literary text, a set of instructions or a government document, and you intentionally erase pieces of the text to find what is either a hidden meaning in there or to manipulate the text in other ways. So the book I was teaching was called Ink Earl, and the poet had taken instructions, like the marketing instructions for an eraser. This is your best writing companion, etc. And it was really quite short. It was, I don't know, maybe 50 words, and produced what she called 100 essays in which she erased bits of it, bits of the existing text to create new poems about love, about sex, about food, about the environment, right? So all of a sudden, this tiny piece of text contained these 100 mini essays, right? So that's erasure poetry, and it's often used in highly political ways to suggest who is left out of the text. She was taking very benign text, but sometimes it's much more politically explosive text. I've had students experiment with this by erasing pieces of the Indian Act, right?
Wow.
To bring up other meanings that are beneath it. So that's one thing that I think some people don't resonate with that, but many people find it fascinating as a kind of technique. So we were talking about what appeals to younger generations. There's also still generations who love rhyming poetry.
Right.
They love to read a series of sonnets, right? So I don't think that that those kinds of more traditional projects are out of style at all. But it's part of my responsibility to show them the wide panoply of choices that, and I think that's often a problem, is that if I say the novel, that means 1,000 different things or more, and that's true of poetry. And I think often poetry is given a very limited, or its reputation seems to be very limited, that it has to be about just sort of what Wordsworth wrote. And I like Wordsworth, but he's not the last word, right?
Yeah.
So part of my job is to suggest that there's a lot more out there than what people may have been exposed to.
Right. Excellent. So listening to you talk about poetry, I can really hear your passion to obviously write it, but also to teach it and promote it and make sure poets have access to the reading community. So there's not just a pedagogical interest, there's also an element of advocacy there too. And can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Um, yes. I think it's one of those things that I'm conscious of, the fact that poetry is mocked a lot as a discourse, and my partner and I have a joke about how often bad poetry appears in a film to signal that someone is out of touch or a doofus or whatever, right? And I'm go, oh, good, a poem, right?
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot for saying this is the ultimate mark of ultimate geekdom.
Right.
But anyway, but also, I'm equally interested in the fact that sometimes poetry appears in a film as a very very good moment.
Mm.
I think of Auden's Funeral Blues appearing in Four Weddings and a Funeral, right?
Oh,
Um,
I
yeah.
hadn't realized that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right. And a number of other things. I mean, think of the biopic of Sylvia Plath,
Mm.
where both Plath and Ted Hughes recite not their own poetry, but recite poetry, classic poetry. She recites Chaucer's The Wife of Bath,
Mm.
right? And they are having this sort of memory battle of who can recite the longest and most and most difficult piece, right? So I like things like that. And yeah, so I said before that poetry needs an advocate,
Right.
right? In order to push back against the rising tide of cries of irrelevance. And I think nothing could be more relevant than a genre that is possibly short, that is eclectic, that is accessible, that is available, that almost anyone can write if they wish. And certainly everyone can read it every day if they wish, because it is short, or
Right.
it's often short,
Yeah.
right? And I think the students, some of the students get lots of exposure to poetry on Instagram. And I know that it's fashionable to denigrate Insta poets, but I won't and I don't, because I think everyone reads poetry that appeals, but maybe is not perfect when they're young.
Hmm.
I could list you my sort, my early encounters with poetry. And it wasn't necessarily they were great poets, but they said, this is possible. Look at someone doing something with words in a small space,
Hmm.
right? And that leads you to someone else, and that leads you to someone else, and
Right.
that leads you to study poetry in university, which leads you to everything else. So
Hmm.
when people have terrible things to say about Instagram poets, I think, come on, everybody starts somewhere.
Hmm.
I don't think it behooves us to be snobs about it, right?
Hmm.
All we can do is say, yeah, that's poetry, and so is this,
Right.
and then introduce them to people like Susan Holbrook, who wrote Ink Earl. Yeah.
So yeah, I want to bring up one of your books that you've written, and your book "Out of Line: Daring to be an Artist Outside of the Big City," and talk about the dynamic you just described. Sort of being an advocate for poetry, um, and how that comes up in this title. The act, as you say, quote, nurturing art making as an act of practice, and and also if you could, as you describe this, talk about what it means for a writer to be, quote, out of line.
Yes, finding a title for this book was quite a process, and I finally settled on Out of Line because I wanted to talk about three ways that title can be construed,
Hmm.
at least three, possibly more. But first, it has a concern with defining this idea of the big city. What is the big city? What is the mid-sized cities? What is the small city? And there's all kinds of factors go into that. And I'm less interested in finding a single definition for that than asking the question that my students asked of me. So if I want to pursue art for a living, do I have to move to Toronto or Montreal or
Right.
Vancouver?
Hmm.
And I said, well, you can, but that doesn't have to be your only choice. And many of them had family here that they didn't want to leave, and they had other obligations that they didn't want to leave. And there is something, certainly, I think that is more welcoming to a young artist in a smaller city, and that again is rent is less high. Right.
Right.
And this is becoming in Kitchener-Waterloo, that's becoming less and less true. However, generally living in a smaller place means a lower cost of living. But it also sometimes means that the arts infrastructure isn't there, that the arts community might be harder to find. And again, there's something about finding people who practice their art in public, even if it's not your art, that is very encouraging and suggesting that you too can find your thing, right? So Out of Line was meant to be sort of out of that direct linear line that would take you on the train into Toronto, right? Out of that kind of line, that geographic line. Also, the idea that if you're going to pursue that, you have to commit to being a rebel of some kind. You have to be commit to cheesing off people when you criticize the city's lack of arts infrastructure. You have to be willing to be out there and to be the one who writes the poem about the difficult material, right? Or paints the painting of what the downtown core looks like with a tent city in it because people are being neglected, etc. You have to be willing to step out of line and say or do your piece. And finally, the other way to think about out of line is there has been a series of scandals of mostly men, but sometimes women stepping out of bounds and treating younger artists badly. And I wanted to draw attention to that as well, that as young people, or I shouldn't say young people, just any beginner artist is searching for community, I wanted to warn them that there will be people out there who do not have their best interests at heart. And that it's good to believe in community. And also some people take advantage of community building to, for nefarious reasons. And I wanted to say that everyone needs to know that, and everyone needs to have a community they can lean on when the bad things happen. Because I don't want them to be naive, thinking if someone's an artist, they've got to be a good person. And I think, yeah, Hitler was a painter, so right? So you can't rely on that, although it's tempting to, right? Here's a person who can make great art and has big feelings and is out there with their feelings. They've got to be a good person.
Right.
I'd love for that to be true, but it just isn't all the time.
You just heard from Dr. Tanis MacDonald. Tanis is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University, editor of the Laurier Poetry Series, and author of several books, including her most recent, Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female. Join us next week for our final episode of this series, which features a wide-ranging discussion that touches on how to keep tabs on contemporary writers, Tanis's own Watershed Writers podcast, which focuses on hyperlocal literature, and her latest book, Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press.
The idea of hyper-local literature is a phrase that is used by the editorial board of Textile Magazine, which has a diversity mandate for finding and encouraging emerging writers from diverse populations. So our slogan at Watershed Writers is read local, think global, right? So we want people to understand that there are writers among us working hard and creating excellent literature.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.